The rain fell hard on the English countryside as Captain James Morrison stepped off the military transport plane. It was November 1941, and the world was burning. Hitler's forces controlled most of Europe. German bombers attacked British cities every night. Japan was preparing for war in the Pacific. America was not yet in the war, but everyone knew it was coming soon. Morrison was only 28 years old, but he was one of the best military engineers in the American Navy. His superiors sent him to Britain with a secret mission. The mission was simple but urgent. Study how the British build their military shelters so fast. Learn their methods. Bring the knowledge back to America. The American military knew they would need thousands of shelters when war came. They needed them quickly. The car took Morrison through bombed streets. He saw destroyed buildings everywhere. Families lived in ruins. Children played in rubble. The British people looked tired, but they did not give up. They kept working. They kept fighting. Morrison felt respect for these tough people. The car stopped at a Royal Air Force base outside London. A tall British sergeant waited at the gate. His name was Thomas Wright. He was 45 years old with gray hair and sharp eyes. His uniform showed medals from the First World War. Wright had seen war before. He knew what worked and what did not. "Captain Morrison, welcome to Britain," Wright said. His handshake was firm and strong. "Thank you, Sergeant. I am here to learn about your Nissen huts," Morrison replied. Wright smiled a tired smile. "Then you came to the right place, sir. Follow me." They walked across the muddy airfield. Morrison saw bomber planes being repaired. Pilots ran to their aircraft. Everyone moved with purpose. There was no time to waste. The Germans could attack again at any moment. Then Morrison saw them. The Nissen huts. They looked like giant metal tubes cut in half and placed on the ground. Simple, basic, not beautiful. But they were everywhere across the base. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. "These huts saved our lives last month," Wright said. "German bombers hit this base hard. Destroyed half our buildings, but we rebuilt in 3 days using Nissen huts." 3 days, Captain. Our pilots were back in the air fighting. Morrison walked closer to examine one hut. It was made of curved metal sheets bolted together. The design came from the First World War. A man named Peter Nissen invented it in 1916. The British used thousands of them in that war. Now they use them again. "How long does it take to build one?" Morrison asked. 4 to 6 hours with a good team of 6 men, Wright answered. No special tools needed. No skilled workers required. Just basic tools and strong backs. Morrison was impressed but also skeptical. "Only 6 hours? That seems impossible." Wright called over some workers. "Show the American captain how we do it." Morrison watched carefully. The workers started with a concrete foundation. Then they bolted the curved metal ribs together. They attached the corrugated metal sheets to the ribs. They sealed the ends. They added a simple door. The whole process moved like a dance. Everyone knew their job. No wasted motion. No confusion. In 5 hours, a complete shelter stood before Morrison. It could house 30 soldiers. It could protect them from bombs and weather. It was not comfortable, but it was ready now. Not tomorrow. Not next week, now. "The beauty is in the simplicity," Wright explained. "Every piece is the same. Every bolt is standard. You can build these anywhere. Desert, jungle, Arctic, does not matter. Simple designs work everywhere." Morrison took notes. He measured everything. He asked many questions. Wright answered them all patiently. As they talked, air raid sirens suddenly screamed across the base. "German bombers incoming," someone shouted. "Into the shelters now," Wright commanded. Morrison and Wright ran into the nearest Nissen hut. Dozens of soldiers crowded inside. The curved metal walls felt thin. Morrison wondered if they would protect anyone from bombs. The sound of aircraft engines grew louder. Then came the explosions. Boom, boom, boom. The ground shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The metal walls rattled but held strong. For 20 minutes, the bombing continued. Morrison had never been under attack before. His heart raced. His hands shook. But Wright and the British soldiers looked calm. They had survived this many times before. Finally, the all-clear siren sounded. Everyone walked outside. 2 buildings were destroyed. A fuel truck was burning. But all the Nissen huts stood undamaged. More importantly, no one died. The simple metal shelter saved lives. "Now you understand, Captain," Wright said. "In war, speed matters most. The best shelter is the one you can build before the bombs fall. Not the most comfortable one. Not the prettiest one. The fastest one. Morrison nodded slowly. He was starting to understand. But in his mind, he was already thinking about improvements. Better insulation. Wooden floors. Windows for light. The American military could make this design even better. They could make it perfect. Wright seemed to read his thoughts. He put a hand on Morrison's shoulder. Captain, I see that look in your eyes. You want to improve our design. That is good. Americans are good at making things better. But remember this warning. Speed is not just about the design. It is about knowing what not to change. Sometimes good enough is better than perfect. Morrison thanked Wright for the advice, but he did not truly listen. He was young. He was confident. He believed American engineering could improve anything. He did not yet understand that war teaches hard lessons. He would learn soon enough. As Morrison flew back to America the next day, he carried detailed plans for the Nissen hut. He also carried British warnings about keeping things simple, but his mind was full of ideas for improvements. He could not wait to show his superiors how America could make this design better. The war was coming to America. They would need shelters fast. Morrison believed he knew exactly what to do. He was wrong. December 7, 1941 changed everything. Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack destroyed much of the American Pacific Fleet. Over 2,000 Americans died in a single morning. The United States was now at war. Suddenly, Captain Morrison's mission became the most important project in the Navy. Morrison stood in a cold warehouse at Quonset Point Naval Base in Rhode Island. Snow covered the ground outside. Inside, a team of 30 engineers waited to hear his presentation. These men would design America's military shelters. Leading them was George Fuller, a brilliant but proud engineer from Boston. Fuller was 40 years old and believed American engineering was the best in the world. "Gentlemen, we are at war," Morrison began. "Our forces will fight across 2 oceans. They will need thousands of shelters, hospitals, command posts, supply warehouses, housing for troops. We must build them fast." He showed them the British Nissen hut plans. The engineers examined the drawings carefully. They measured. They calculated. They discussed. "It is a good basic design," Fuller finally said, "but we can make it much better." Morrison felt uneasy. He remembered Sergeant Wright's warning about keeping things simple. But Fuller was his superior officer. Fuller had more experience. Fuller knew best. Or so Morrison thought. "What improvements do you suggest, sir?" Morrison asked. Fuller smiled. He walked to a large blackboard and began drawing. "First, we make it bigger. The British design is too small. American soldiers need more space. We increase the width from 16 feet to 20 feet. We increase the length from 30 feet to 48 feet. The other engineers nodded in agreement. Bigger was better. That was the American way. Second, we add proper insulation, Fuller continued. The British use nothing. Metal walls get hot in summer and cold in winter. We add fiberboard insulation between the metal layers. Much more comfortable. Morrison raised his hand. "Sir, that will add weight and complexity. It will take longer to build." Fuller waved away the concern. "Comfort matters, Captain. Our troops deserve better than cold metal walls." "Third, we add wooden floors," Fuller said. "The British put dirt or concrete floors. We use proper wood, cleaner, warmer, more civilized. Fourth, we add windows. Natural light is important. The British design is too dark inside. Fifth, we improve the door. The British use a simple flap. We design a proper door with a lock and frame." The list grew longer. Better ventilation, stronger roof supports, improved foundation design. Each improvement made sense individually. Together they transformed the simple Nissen hut into something much more complex. "We will call it the Quonset hut," Fuller announced. "Named after this base where we perfected the design. It will be the finest military shelter in the world." The engineers applauded. Everyone felt proud. They were making history. American innovation would win the war. Only Morrison felt doubt growing in his mind. But he was young. He was junior. He kept quiet. He did not want to seem negative or unpatriotic. This was war. Everyone had to work together. For 3 months, the team worked day and night perfecting the Quonset hut design. They built prototypes. They tested materials. They solved problems. By March 1942, they had a final design ready for mass production. The first full-scale test happened on a cold spring morning. A construction crew of 8 men began building a Quonset hut at 6 in the morning. Morrison watched with Fuller and the other engineers. Everyone expected success, but problems appeared immediately. The larger size made the metal sheets harder to handle. They needed special lifting equipment. The insulation had to be cut carefully to fit. The wooden floor required precise measurements. The windows needed careful installation to prevent leaks. At noon, the hut was only half finished. By 6 in the evening, they were still working. Finally, at 10 at night, 16 hours after starting, the first Quonset hut was complete. 16 hours, Morrison said quietly. The British Nissen hut takes 6 hours. But look at the quality, Fuller replied. Look at the comfort. Our soldiers will thank us, Morrison wanted to argue. He wanted to say that speed mattered more than comfort in war. But he stayed silent. Fuller was in charge. Production began at factories across America. By summer 1942, thousands of Quonset huts were being shipped to military bases worldwide. The Navy ordered them. The Army ordered them. The Marines ordered them. Everyone wanted the famous American Quonset hut. But then reports started coming back from the field. Commanders complained about construction delays. The huts required more shipping space than expected. The extra components meant more weight. More weight meant fewer huts per ship. Fewer huts per ship meant longer waits for supplies. In the Pacific, where Japan controlled thousands of islands, speed was critical. American forces captured islands and needed shelters immediately. Before the Japanese could counterattack, before tropical storms hit, before soldiers suffered in the heat, Lieutenant Sarah Chen commanded a construction battalion in the Solomon Islands. She was 26 years old and the daughter of Chinese immigrants. Chen joined the military to prove women could serve in combat zones. She was tough and smart and did not accept excuses. Chen's battalion received orders to build a field hospital on a newly captured island. Japanese forces still controlled islands nearby. They could attack at any time. The hospital needed to be ready in 3 days. Her crew unpacked the Quonset hut components. They studied the instructions. They started building. But the tropical heat made the metal burning hot to touch. The insulation was difficult to install in humid conditions. The wooden floors swelled in moisture. The windows cracked during installation. Chen radioed headquarters. She asked for Major Morrison, who had been promoted for his work on the Quonset hut project. Major Morrison, this is Lieutenant Chen, she said. We have a serious problem. We started building 4 days ago. We are still not finished. The Japanese could attack tonight. Our wounded have no shelter. What do I tell them? Morrison felt his stomach tighten. He knew this was his fault. He should have spoken up. He should have fought to keep the design simple. Do your best, Lieutenant, Morrison said. Work through the night if necessary. We needed shelter yesterday, not next week, Chen replied. Her voice was angry and scared. Then the radio went dead. Morrison sat in his office staring at maps of the Pacific. Little flags marked where Quonset huts were being built. Many flags had notes attached. Construction delayed. Parts missing. Weather problems. The beautiful American design was failing in the field. That night, Morrison could not sleep. He thought about Sergeant Wright's warning. Speed is not just about the design. It is about knowing what not to change. The British were still using their simple Nissen huts across North Africa and Europe. They built field hospitals in hours. They erected command posts under fire. Their simple design worked everywhere. Hot desert, cold mountains, bombed cities. The Nissen hut adapted to any condition because it was simple. The American Quonset hut was better in many ways. More comfortable, better insulated, stronger, but it was slower. And in war, slower meant dangerous. Slower meant lives lost. Morrison made a decision. He would visit the combat zones himself. He would see both designs in action. He would learn the truth. Then he would write a report telling the military what really worked, even if it meant admitting American engineering had failed. Even if it meant his career was over, the truth mattered more than pride. The transport ship rolled through heavy waves as Major Morrison traveled toward Guadalcanal in September 1942. The Battle of Guadalcanal had been raging for weeks. American Marines fought Japanese forces in brutal jungle combat. Thousands of men were dying. They needed field hospitals desperately. They needed command posts. They needed supply warehouses. They needed shelters. Morrison finally convinced his superiors to let him visit the combat zones. He told them he needed to assess the Quonset hut performance in field conditions. The truth was deeper. He needed to see if American pride had cost American lives. The ship carried supplies and reinforcements. Below deck, Morrison saw stacks of Quonset hut components: metal sheets, insulation panels, wooden floorboards, window frames. So many parts, so much weight. The ship could have carried more ammunition or food or medicine. Instead, it carried building materials for shelters that took too long to build. On deck, Morrison met a Marine captain named Rodriguez. Rodriguez had just returned from Guadalcanal for medical treatment. A Japanese bullet had grazed his shoulder. His arm was in a sling, but his eyes were hard and angry. "You are the Quonset hut engineer," Rodriguez said. It was not a question. Word traveled fast in the military. "Yes," Morrison admitted. "How are the huts performing?" Rodriguez laughed bitterly. "We lost 12 men last week because their Quonset hut hospital was not finished when the Japanese attacked. The wounded had nowhere to go. They died in the mud waiting for shelter that took too long to build." Morrison felt sick. "I am sorry." "Sorry does not bring back the dead," Rodriguez said. He walked away. The ship reached Guadalcanal 3 days later. The island looked like hell. Smoke rose from burning jungle. The sound of artillery was constant. Dead bodies floated in the water. The smell of death filled the air. Lieutenant Sarah Chen met Morrison at the beach. She looked exhausted. Her uniform was dirty and torn. She had lost weight. Dark circles showed under her eyes, but her voice was still strong. "Major Morrison, welcome to paradise," she said without smiling. "Lieutenant Chen, thank you for agreeing to show me around," Morrison replied. They walked through the military base. Morrison saw chaos everywhere. Construction crews worked frantically. Some buildings were half finished. Some were abandoned. Supplies were scattered across the ground. Everything was behind schedule. Chen showed him 3 Quonset huts in various stages of construction. The first one was nearly complete after 6 days of work. Japanese bombing raids kept forcing the crew to stop work and take cover. The tropical rain ruined materials. The heat exhausted workers. "We need shelters now, not next week," Chen explained. "The Japanese attack constantly. Our supplies are exposed to weather. Our wounded sleep on the ground. The Quonset hut is a good design for a peaceful base in America. But this is war. We need fast, not fancy." Morrison examined the construction process carefully. He took notes. He asked questions. He watched the workers struggle with heavy materials in brutal conditions. Every problem he saw could be traced back to the improvements Fuller added. Bigger size meant heavier parts. Insulation meant more components. Wooden floors meant precise measurements. Windows meant careful installation. Chen led him to a nearby hill. From there, Morrison could see a different kind of shelter in the valley below. British and Australian forces were working alongside Americans. They were building Nissen huts. "Watch them," Chen said. Morrison watched. A crew of 6 men worked on a Nissen hut. They moved with practiced efficiency. No wasted motion, no confusion. The curved metal ribs went up quickly. The corrugated sheets attached fast. No insulation to install. No windows to fit. No wooden floors to measure. Just simple metal and bolts. In 4 hours, the Nissen hut was complete. The British soldiers immediately began storing medical supplies inside. Protected from rain, protected from bombs. Ready to save lives. "That is what we need," Chen said quietly. "Simple and fast." That night, Japanese bombers attacked the base. Air raid sirens screamed. Everyone ran for shelter. Morrison followed Chen into the nearest completed building. It was a Nissen hut, not a Quonset hut. Inside, 50 soldiers crowded together. The curved metal walls felt thin. Morrison could hear the Japanese aircraft engines overhead. Then came the whistle of falling bombs. The sound grew louder, louder. Boom, boom, boom. The explosions shook the ground. Dust fell from the ceiling. The metal walls rattled. Morrison pressed himself against the wall, terrified. He had been in bombings in Britain. But that felt different. That was research. This was real combat. This was his life on the line. A bomb exploded very close. The shockwave hit the Nissen hut like a giant hammer. The structure bent but did not break. Metal is flexible. It absorbs shock. The simple design saved them. For 30 minutes, the bombing continued. Morrison prayed silently. He thought about his family back in America. He thought about all the improvements he added to the Quonset hut. He thought about the 12 Marines who died waiting for their hospital to be completed. Finally, the all-clear siren sounded. Everyone walked outside carefully. 2 Quonset huts were destroyed by direct bomb hits. One was still under construction and collapsed completely. Another was damaged because the windows shattered and weakened the structure. But all the British Nissen huts survived with only minor damage. Simple metal bent and absorbed shock. No windows to break. No insulation to burn. Just curved steel that protected lives. Chen walked Morrison around the damaged base. She showed him the cost of complexity, the cost of unnecessary improvements, the cost of American pride. My crew can build a Quonset hut in 16 hours in perfect conditions, Chen explained. But we never have perfect conditions. Weather delays us. Enemy attacks stop us. Supply problems slow us. That 16 hours becomes 3 days, sometimes a week. Meanwhile, soldiers die because they have no shelter. Morrison saw a work crew clearing rubble from a destroyed Quonset hut. The wooden floor was burning. The insulation had scattered across the ground. All those improvements, that seemed so smart in a Rhode Island warehouse, looked like expensive mistakes on a battlefield. A young private approached Morrison. He could not have been older than 19. His baby face was covered in dirt and fear. "Sir, are you the engineer who designed these huts?" the private asked. "Yes," Morrison admitted. "My brother died last month," the private said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were wet with tears. He was wounded in combat. They took him to the field hospital, but the hospital was not finished yet. Just a foundation and some metal frames. No roof, no walls. It rained that night. He died from infection because he had no shelter. The private walked away before Morrison could respond. What could he say? Sorry? Sorry was meaningless. His improvements killed that boy's brother. His pride killed American soldiers. That night, Morrison could not sleep. He lay on a cot in a tent and stared at the ceiling. He could hear distant gunfire. He could hear wounded men screaming in pain. He could hear construction crews working through the night trying to finish shelters before the next Japanese attack. He thought about Sergeant Wright's warning in Britain. Speed is not just about the design. It is about knowing what not to change. Wright understood war. He survived the First World War. He knew that perfect is the enemy of good enough. Morrison made a decision. Tomorrow, he would visit the European theater. He would see British Nissen huts in action across North Africa and Italy. He would compare them directly to American Quonset huts. He would gather all the evidence. Then he would write a report telling the truth, even if it destroyed his career, even if Fuller and the other engineers hated him, even if the military brass refused to listen. He would tell the truth, because more American lives depended on getting this right. The war was far from over. There would be more islands to capture, more battles to fight, more soldiers who needed shelter. Morrison would make sure they got what they needed, not what looked good in a design presentation. Major Morrison arrived in Sicily in November 1942, just as Allied forces were preparing for the invasion of mainland Italy. The Mediterranean sun was hot, but not as brutal as the Pacific jungle. The war in Europe felt different from the Pacific. Faster movement, bigger armies, more sophisticated enemy tactics. The Germans were not like the Japanese. They had better equipment and better training. Morrison traveled with a military convoy heading north. They passed through destroyed Italian villages. Ancient churches reduced to rubble. Farms burned to ash. Civilians wandered through ruins looking for food and lost family members. War destroyed everything beautiful. At a British military base near Naples, Morrison finally met Sergeant Wright again. Wright looked older now. More gray hair. Deeper lines on his face. But his eyes were still sharp and knowing. "Captain Morrison," Wright said, then corrected himself. "I mean Major Morrison now. Congratulations on your promotion." "Thank you, Sergeant," Morrison replied. I need to see your Nissen huts in action. Wright studied Morrison's face carefully. He saw something different in the young American's eyes. Less confidence. More doubt. Good. Doubt meant learning. Follow me, Wright said. They drove in a military jeep through the Italian countryside. Wright explained the current military situation. The Germans controlled strong defensive positions in the mountains. Allied forces were slowly pushing north. Every mile was paid for in blood. Casualties were heavy on both sides. We build field hospitals every few miles, Wright explained. When our troops advance, we move the hospitals forward with them. Speed is everything. Wounded men die if they wait too long for treatment. They stopped at a hill overlooking a valley. Below, Morrison saw a massive military operation. Hundreds of soldiers, dozens of tanks, supply trucks everywhere, and scattered across the valley were shelters. Many shelters. Morrison could see both British Nissen huts and American Quonset huts. Watch carefully, Wright said. You will learn something today. A military messenger ran up to Wright. Sergeant, we just received orders. The advance is happening tomorrow morning. We need to build 3 field hospitals 15 miles north. Orders say complete them by dawn. Wright checked his watch. It was noon. 18 hours to build 3 hospitals. Can be done. He turned to his construction crews. Move out! Morrison followed Wright's teams as they drove north toward German positions. The sound of artillery grew louder. Smoke rose from burning buildings. This was the front line, the most dangerous place in the war. Wright's teams reached the designated locations. Empty fields behind Allied lines. Close enough to treat wounded quickly, far enough to be somewhat protected from German artillery. 3 separate sites. 3 different crews. Morrison watched in amazement as the British crews worked. They unloaded Nissen hut components from trucks, metal ribs, corrugated sheets, bolts, simple tools. Nothing complicated. Nothing fancy. Each crew had 8 men. They moved like machines. No confusion. No wasted motion. Everyone knew exactly what to do. They had built hundreds of these huts before. The curved metal ribs went up first, strong but light. 2 men could lift each piece. The ribs were bolted to concrete foundations that were already prepared. Then came the corrugated metal sheets. They overlapped and bolted together. Each sheet covered a large area quickly. No insulation to install. No windows to fit carefully. No wooden floors to measure precisely. Just metal and bolts. Simple engineering that worked. Morrison timed them carefully. 4.5 hours after starting, the first Nissen hut hospital was complete. Medical teams immediately began moving equipment inside. Beds, surgical tables, medicine, everything a field hospital needed. Meanwhile, not far away, an American crew worked on a Quonset hut. Morrison watched them struggle. The larger size meant heavier components. More men were needed to lift each piece. The insulation had to be installed carefully. The wooden floorboards had to be cut to fit exactly. The windows required precise installation. As the sun set, the British crews had completed all 3 Nissen hut hospitals. They were ready to receive wounded soldiers. Medical staff were already inside preparing for the morning battle. The American Quonset hut was only half finished. The crew worked under electric lights, exhausted and frustrated. They would need at least another 8 hours. Maybe more if problems occurred. That night, Morrison sat with Wright drinking tea in a command tent. The old sergeant studied the young major quietly. You understand now, Wright said. It was not a question. Yes, Morrison admitted. We made it too complicated. Americans always make things complicated, Wright said with a slight smile. You believe you can improve everything. Sometimes you can. Sometimes you cannot. I should have listened to you in Britain, Morrison said. Wright shook his head. No, you had to see for yourself. Young men never listen to old men. That is life. The important thing is whether you learn from your mistakes. Suddenly, artillery fire erupted nearby. German shells began falling on Allied positions. The attack was unexpected. Everyone ran for shelter. Morrison and Wright dove into the nearest building. It was one of the Nissen huts built that afternoon. Inside, wounded soldiers were already being treated. Doctors performed surgery by lamplight. Nurses moved quickly between beds. Everyone worked calmly despite the explosions outside. A German shell hit very close. The blast shook the entire structure. Dust fell from the ceiling. But the curved metal walls held firm. The simple design absorbed the shock wave. The flexible metal bent but did not break. Through the chaos, medical teams continued working. They saved lives while bombs fell around them. The Nissen hut gave them the protection they needed. Nothing fancy, nothing comfortable, just reliable shelter that worked when it mattered most. The shelling lasted 2 hours. When it finally stopped, Morrison and Wright walked outside to assess damage. Several buildings were destroyed. Trees were blown apart. Craters covered the ground, but all 3 Nissen hut hospitals survived. They had minor damage but were still functional. Medical teams continued treating wounded soldiers without interruption. The half-finished American Quonset hut was destroyed. A direct hit collapsed the incomplete structure. All those components scattered across the field. The wooden floors burning. The insulation shredded. Months of factory production wasted. More importantly, if that had been a completed hospital, patients would have died when it collapsed. The stronger, heavier components actually made it more dangerous when damaged. The Nissen hut's flexibility was its strength. Morrison took extensive notes. He photographed everything. He interviewed soldiers and medical staff. Everyone told him the same thing. Simple and fast beats complex and slow. In war, good enough now saves more lives than perfect later. Over the next 2 weeks, Morrison traveled across Italy studying both shelter designs. He saw British forces using Nissen huts effectively everywhere. Frontline field hospitals, command posts under fire, supply depots in bombed cities, emergency shelters built in hours. He also saw American Quonset huts. They worked well in rear areas. Safe bases far from combat. Places where construction could take days without danger. Places where comfort mattered more than speed. Both designs had value, but they served different purposes. The Nissen hut was a combat tool. The Quonset hut was a base building. Trying to make one design do both jobs was the mistake. On his last day in Italy, Morrison visited a military cemetery. Thousands of white crosses marked American graves. Young men who died far from home. Some died in combat. Some died from wounds because medical treatment came too late. Some died because shelters were not ready when needed. Morrison knelt before one grave. Private Michael Chen, age 19, died from wounds October 1942. Lieutenant Sarah Chen's younger brother. She never mentioned having a brother in the Pacific. She never said he died waiting for a field hospital to be completed. Morrison understood now. Chen's anger was not just professional. It was personal. Her brother died because American engineering tried to be perfect instead of fast. Wright found Morrison at the cemetery. The old sergeant stood silently beside him. "How many died because of my pride?" Morrison asked quietly. "Wrong question," Wright replied. "Right question is how many will you save by admitting the truth?" Morrison stood up. He knew what he had to do. Write a complete report. Tell the military leadership everything he learned. Recommend using Nissen huts for frontline emergency situations. Recommend using Quonset huts for rear bases. Admit that American improvements failed their main purpose. It would be the hardest thing he ever did. Fuller would fight him. Other engineers would call him unpatriotic. His career might end. But the truth mattered more than pride. American lives mattered more than American ego. The war was far from over. D-Day was coming. The invasion of France would be the biggest military operation in history. Thousands of soldiers would need medical treatment. They would need shelter fast. Morrison would make sure they got what they needed. Major Morrison returned to Washington in January 1943. The city was busy with war planning. Generals studied maps. Politicians gave speeches. Factory workers produced weapons day and night. Everyone believed in American superiority. American engineering. American innovation. American victory. Morrison carried a briefcase full of photographs, notes, and interviews. Evidence from 2 war theaters. Pacific and Europe. Combat zones where theory met reality. Where American pride met hard truth. He requested a meeting with the Navy construction leadership. George Fuller was there. Admiral Harrison commanded the meeting. 12 senior officers attended. All of them believed the Quonset hut was a triumph of American engineering. Morrison's hands shook as he stood to present. He was 30 years old, the youngest person in the room. These officers could end his career with one word. But he thought about Private Chen dying in the rain, about the 12 Marines lost waiting for their hospital, about all the soldiers who died because shelters came too slow. "Gentlemen, I have completed my field assessment of our military shelters," Morrison began. I must report that our Quonset hut design has fundamental problems in combat conditions. The room went silent. Officers stared at him in shock. Fuller stood up angrily. Major Morrison, that is a serious accusation. The Quonset hut is serving our forces well across the world. No, sir, it is not, Morrison said. His voice was steady now. In rear areas, the Quonset hut performs excellently, but in frontline combat situations, it fails its primary purpose. Speed. Morrison showed his photographs. British crews building Nissen huts in 4 hours. American crews taking 3 days to complete Quonset huts in combat conditions. Field hospitals delayed. Wounded soldiers dying. Supplies exposed to enemy fire. The British Nissen hut can be built by 6 men in 4 to 6 hours with basic tools, Morrison explained. Our Quonset hut requires 8 to 12 men, specialized equipment, and 16 to 24 hours in ideal conditions. In combat with enemy attacks in bad weather, it takes even longer. Fuller interrupted. But Major, our design is superior. Better insulation, wooden floors, windows, more comfort for our troops. Comfort does not matter if soldiers die waiting for shelter, Morrison said firmly. I interviewed hundreds of men in combat zones. They do not want comfort. They want protection, fast. Admiral Harrison raised his hand for silence. Major Morrison, what exactly are you recommending? Morrison took a deep breath. This was the moment that would define his career. I recommend we continue producing Quonset huts for rear bases and semi-permanent installations. They excel in those roles. But for frontline emergency situations, we should adopt the British Nissen hut design. Build them under license. Train our crews on rapid construction. Use the right tool for each job. The room erupted in argument. Some officers agreed with Morrison. Others defended the Quonset hut. Fuller called Morrison unpatriotic, said he was giving up on American innovation, said the British design was inferior. Morrison let them argue. Then he showed one final photograph. A military cemetery, thousands of graves, American soldiers who died because the right equipment came too late. Gentlemen, this war will get worse before it gets better, Morrison said quietly. D-Day is coming. We will invade France. Thousands of soldiers will be wounded. They will need field hospitals immediately. Not in 3 days. Not next week. Immediately. We must give them the fastest possible shelters, not the most comfortable ones. The fastest ones. Admiral Harrison studied Morrison carefully. The old admiral had fought in World War I. He understood combat. He understood sacrifice. Major Morrison, your report is noted, Harrison said. This committee will review your recommendations and make a decision within 2 weeks. The meeting ended. Morrison walked out feeling exhausted. He did his duty. He told the truth. Now his career was probably over, but something unexpected happened. Field commanders started supporting Morrison's report. Officers who actually fought in combat wrote letters to Washington. They agreed with Morrison. They needed fast shelters more than comfortable ones. Lieutenant Sarah Chen wrote a powerful letter. She described losing her brother Michael because the field hospital was not ready. She described 12 Marines dying for the same reason. She said Morrison was right. Speed saves lives. Other combat veterans added their voices. Men who built shelters under fire. Men who watched friends die waiting for protection. Men who knew the difference between theory and reality. 2 weeks later, Admiral Harrison called another meeting. Fuller was there looking angry. Morrison was there looking nervous. We have reviewed Major Morrison's recommendations, Harrison began. We have also received extensive feedback from field commanders. The decision is made. Morrison held his breath. We will implement a dual strategy, Harrison continued. Quonset huts will continue production for rear area bases and semi-permanent installations. They serve that role excellently. But we will also begin production of British Nissen huts under license for frontline emergency use. Major Morrison will lead the training program for rapid construction techniques. Fuller stood up to protest, but Harrison raised his hand. This is not about pride, Colonel Fuller. This is about saving American lives. Major Morrison had the courage to tell us the truth. That deserves recognition, not punishment. He is promoted to lieutenant colonel effective immediately. Morrison could barely believe it. He expected to lose his career. Instead, he got promoted. More importantly, soldiers would get the shelters they needed. The next 6 months were busy. Morrison traveled to training bases teaching rapid construction techniques, simple methods, no fancy equipment, just soldiers, basic tools, and British-inspired Nissen huts. When D-Day came in June 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. The largest invasion in history, thousands of soldiers landed under heavy German fire. Casualties were enormous, but behind the beaches, construction crews built field hospitals in hours using Nissen huts. Wounded soldiers received treatment quickly. Lives were saved. Morrison's report made that possible. The war continued through 1945. American forces captured islands across the Pacific. British and American troops pushed through France and Germany. Everywhere they went, both types of shelters served their purposes. Nissen huts for emergency frontline use, Quonset huts for comfortable rear bases. In April 1945, Morrison received a letter from Lieutenant Chen. She had been promoted to captain. Her construction battalion was in the Philippines preparing for the invasion of Japan. "Dear Colonel Morrison," the letter said, "I wanted to thank you for having the courage to tell the truth. We are building Nissen hut hospitals here in hours. When combat starts, we will be ready. My brother Michael died because we were not ready. Other brothers will live because we learned from that mistake. You made that possible. Thank you." Morrison kept that letter for the rest of his life. The war ended in August 1945 after atomic bombs forced Japan to surrender. Morrison returned home to Rhode Island. He was 32 years old. He had helped win the war by admitting American engineering was not perfect. After the war, Morrison became a professor of engineering. He taught young students about design and innovation, but he always started his classes with the same lesson. Innovation without understanding context is just expensive delay. He would tell his students, before you improve something, ask yourself what problem you are really solving. Ask who will use your design and where they will use it. Ask if your improvements actually help or just satisfy your ego. He would show them photographs from the war. Nissen huts built in 4 hours. Quonset huts taking 3 days. Field hospitals ready or not ready. Soldiers living or dying. Sometimes the best improvement is knowing what not to improve, Morrison taught. Sometimes good enough now is better than perfect later. That is the hardest lesson in engineering. And the most important one. His students listened carefully. Some would become great engineers. Some would design buildings and bridges. Some would create new technologies. But all of them would remember Morrison's lesson about context and speed, and knowing when simple is better than complex. The war taught America many lessons. How to build aircraft carriers, how to produce tanks quickly, how to coordinate massive military operations. But one of the most important lessons was the simplest. In war and in life, speed matters. The best shelter is the one you can build before the storm hits, not the prettiest one, not the most comfortable one, the one that is ready when you need it. Morrison lived to be 87 years old. He died peacefully in 1999, surrounded by family. At his funeral, dozens of veterans came to pay respects. Old men who fought in World War II. Men whose lives were saved by shelters built quickly. Men who remembered that one engineer who had the courage to admit the truth. Sergeant Thomas Wright sent a letter from Britain. He was 92 years old and could not travel. But he wanted Morrison's family to know something important. Your father learned the hardest lesson in engineering, Wright wrote. Pride kills. Humility saves. He chose humility when it cost him everything. That choice saved thousands of lives. The world needs more engineers like him. Morrison's story became legend in engineering schools, a reminder that innovation must serve purpose, not ego. That understanding context matters more than blind improvement. That sometimes the bravest thing an engineer can do is admit their design is wrong. Both the Nissen hut and Quonset hut are still used today. Museums preserve them as historical artifacts. Military historians study them as examples of wartime engineering. But more importantly, they remind us that in crisis, speed and simplicity save lives. The lesson Morrison learned in Blood and War. The lesson he taught for 50 years. The lesson that engineers must never forget.